If this is your first time visiting, my name is Ann Spencer, and I am a product person. And in a prior life, I had the great delight of meeting Pete Warden and becoming his editor. And we've had so many conversations over the years about industry and whatnot. And I've always found these conversations quite useful. And I really appreciate an opportunity to record some of these conversations for everyone else as well.
Yeah, and I'm Pete Warden. I've really enjoyed my conversations with Anne as well. I like to say that I was doing AI before it started working on the TensorFlow team at Google, and now with my own startup.
So, for people who are new to our series, right, in earlier episodes, we touched upon voice assistants, speech to text models, as well as a more specific approach of speech to intent to try to handle some of the challenges that we're seeing with voice assistants. So, today's conversation is actually going to be a bit different. We're going to be covering some of the recent industry moments, particularly for voice assistants, most notably from Google, Microsoft, and Reddit. So, Pete, I know in some of our earlier discussions, you had mentioned more of a spotlight on voice assistants and interfaces. I'm like, the universe heard you and then responded the last couple of weeks. I definitely have felt that when I was looking through so many of the things. And before we dive into some of the specifics, I know last time I asked you about Alexa and latency. Can you provide me from your level of experience, like at a macro level, why you think that perhaps there are so many announcements at the end of the year? Because I haven't really seen something like this before around conversational AI and voice assistants, like so many.
Yeah, and I think that we saw a few months ago OpenAI really pushing voice and making it clear that it was an integral part of what they're doing. And I think honestly, a lot of people sat up and took notice. And once you start looking at voice, there are some pretty obvious problems. And that's where I think a lot of these announcements come from. And I'll let you dive into, you know, in your notes, you had an excellent summary of all these things that have been happening, some of which I'd completely missed. So,
I love that you're so honest. You're
yeah,
just so honest about everything. I just love that. I love that. So what? There were so many announcements. So I only picked a few just because there just seemed to be so many. But the ones that jumped out at me in particular, for example, with Gemini, right? There was talking about so much of the multimodal capabilities and the possibilities, not just towards voice assistants, but also universal assistant. And I think the project in particular that jumped out at me was Astra, right?
yeah.
So I know that you stored in Google, as you mentioned, and how I don't. And you also worked on some of the early speech libraries. I remember you mentioning that in some of the earlier episodes and stuff. And what are your thoughts about Astra, right, as a research project, in particular about how it may help develop, right, a voice or universal assistant? I would love to get your take, or as much as you're comfortable with, considering you used to work at Google, right?
Yeah. The nice thing about Google is there are a lot of people there who've been working on voice for a very long time. So there's this kind of deep foundation of understanding what works with voice and what doesn't. And
Mm-hmm.
what I've been seeing in like the Astra announcements is I do feel like they're pulling in some of their expertise that's giving them a bit of a leg
Mm-hmm.
up when it comes to some of the other players in this field who don't have kind of this team with decades of experience trying to do this, kind of informing everything they're doing. Um, so they seem to be focused on a lot of the right problems. You noted kind of like the latency announcements that maybe you could
Mm-hmm.
talk a little bit more about, but um, those show a lot of user experience understanding, which I think is a lot harder to get if you're more of a research focused organization without that experience of actually shipping voice interfaces for years to consumers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, for those of you who have not seen the announcement, that was something that was mentioned, right? In terms of addressing latency, better memory, in-session memory with conversations, and this actually, made me think about Pete, obviously, because of a recent episode we did on latency. with voice assistants. So I thought that was really interesting, and I think it's interesting from your perspective of how Google is taking more advantage of some of their strengths, right?
Yeah,
Right,
and
especially with some, yeah,
this is one of the first times that I've seen anybody publicly talk about latency as a really important measurement for voice interfaces, at least in this
right,
current round of things, and that's been you know my white whale I've been chasing for years because I've seen it myself when using voice interfaces, and I've seen users just constantly running into this thing where they get frustrated because you're talking to something and then you're just waiting too long to get anything back. And
mm-hmm.
we know from years of user experience research with visual interfaces that just kills the whole experience. Anything over 200 milliseconds just kills everything. And it's really nice to see this kind of coming into the spotlight more now with things like Astra. So that was my biggest, like most exciting takeaway from that was, oh great, there's more people actually focused on this.
Yeah. What I also would take away from me about Astra was the whole multiple languages, right,
Yeah.
possibility, right? I thought that was super fascinating, especially how with latency and languages, as we talked before, I'm like, I personally oftentimes feel a beat or two behind with some of the live translation experiences. So I definitely see why latency is needed. So thank you for that perspective on Astra. So somewhat adjacent to Google was the recent podcast interview with the CEO of Microsoft AI, who was also at DeepMind, right? And one of the things that really jumped out at me when he was being interviewed was how he talked about how the importance of usefulness for everyday consumers, right? Which is something that you obviously have talked about on your blog, and we talked about
Yes.
here with various episodes and stuff. So I thought this is nice to hear this theme repeated throughout the industry, right? I think one of the things that he also noted in that particular interview that kind of jumped out to me that I'm parsing is this idea of emotion, right? Emotional intelligence, an emotional connection to a conversational AI. And we actually didn't really talk about that when we talked about perceptions of intelligence, because I remember one of your previous blog posts, you talked about how the way AI is happening right now with language models and whatnot, it's like challenging what we used to think about AI and what it's supposed to be, right? Do you have any thoughts about or takeaways about this perception of emotion, right, with conversational AI in terms of voice assistants and when you're engaging with them?
Yeah, and I'd like to look back at the history of visual UIs as well. And if you think about Microsoft, or not Microsoft, sorry, the Mac in the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
so much of the loyalty that people felt to that operating system was because it had a personality. It actually had, and it had a design sense, and it felt warm and welcoming, and there was a whole world of people who were really drawn to that in a way that all these other computing platforms at the time they were very off-putting. And for voice interfaces, I see that on steroids. Like there's going to be so much about them because you're going to be feeling like you're talking to a person, and you don't want to be talking to a person who's a jerk. You want to be talking to a person who you want to be talking to, who you want to spend time with. So getting all of that emotional and all of that deeper stuff right is going to be so important um, as we sort of dive into this. And we're not going to get it all at once. Like we're probably going to start off with things that feel very robotic to talk to, but hopefully kind of move along the spectrum so that we actually are able to develop all of the things that we need to have something that's kind of fun and emotionally rewarding to actually spend time with.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're almost at time, but there's one last announcement that I really wanted to get your opinion on, and that's the Reddit. They're testing out conversational AI, right? And this totally reminded me of an earlier episode that we talked about when you said that you had spoken to customers right, about their knowledge bases and how they engage with them. And Reddit Answers is doing something similar, right? They're like testing it out about for their Q&A and stuff like that. So if you can, if you're comfortable, I would love to hear your experiences talking to customers with that when they're doing some sort of voice interface with their own knowledge bases, their own Q&A knowledge bases.
Yeah, and for me, the foundation of the Reddit announcement was I feel like Google is more and more relying on Reddit as a source of non-SEO, like real human answers. And that's become a much bigger and bigger part of their search. And that, of course, means that Reddit is in a good position to say, hey, actually, this is all of our content. Like, let's build something on top of this that's actually going to offer this value ourselves versus kind of farming it out to Google to kind of send people back. So for me, that was the biggest takeaway. I almost felt like the voice side was great. I love to see it, but just building a conversational search engine on top of Reddit makes absolute sense. Like, I would love, it's something I could see myself using. So that's part of why I thought it was such a really interesting idea.
I love us talking about this kind of stuff because I feel like in an earlier episode that you wish more people would be doing more stuff with it, right? Now we're actually seeing it. It's like you put it out in the universe and the universe responded, right?
Yes.
Over the holidays. So much fun. But yes, we're at time, and I appreciate all the insights and you answering all my questions, right? And your patience with my questions about what about this? What about this? I just read this. What about this? Right? So
well, like I said, there's so much research there that you've done that, you're helping uncover things I hadn't run across. So thank you to you too.
Okay. Right. Look forward to the next one. Thanks again for the time. Okay.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.